yourself back in time to the 1850s. The British colony of Melbourne, Victoria, Australia is thriving. Frederick McCoy is appointed the first director of the new Museum of Victoria. He plans to produce the Natural History of Victoria publication called the Prodromus. The word prodromus means preliminary description. Over the next several decades, McCoy publishes a 2-volume edition of the Prodromus. He plans to do more, but there are complications, and the project remains in the archives at Museum Victoria for over 100 years. Jump forward to the 21st century. We meet John Keane, a visual artist by background. He takes a sabbatical from his job as an exhibition producer to undertake a Thomas Ramsay Research Fellowship. He is joined by Beck Carland, who has a history background, and together they analyse the Prodromus collection.
McCoy intended this publication as the first stage in a much more ambitious project to describe all of the animals in classes. You'll get a mix of fish, lizards, bryozoans, echinoderms, all sorts of animals mixed up. He intended later on to reprint those descriptions and have all the snakes together, all the lizards together, all the mammals together, that would become the complete biology of Victoria.
His style of writing is just really engaging, really different, I think, to a lot of the museum practices that followed.
He sat in the middle at Melbourne University in his laboratory and his apartments, and through his correspondence and connections in the colony, he had specimens delivered to him, and opportunistically he would sort of tick off various species. The specimen would come into the museum fresh or reasonably fresh, and it would be taken over to the illustrator, very often Arthur Bartholomew, who would do straight taxonomic illustrations of the animal, usually from the side, the top, the bottom, to capture its diagnostic characteristics, and also to capture the colours of life while the specimen was still fresh. With insects, they'd keep them alive in Wardian cases, like little hothouses, and they'd make observations of the animal as it changed from one state to another. If it was a fish, quite often after the illustrations were done, McCoy or Bartholomew would sort of cut the animal open, and McCoy liked to do drawings of the fish's guts. After that was done, they'd drop the specimen into a spirit jar, or if it was a butterfly or an insect, pin it into a drawer and preserve it. A lot of those specimens are still in the collection. It's a magnificent and big project. He started the thinking of it and the commissioning of artists in the late 1850s, and he was still commissioning artists in the early 1890s. So it's almost it's like a 35-year project.
And in our research, we found in the collection store the last plate still on a lithographic stone, the unpublished Prodromus. Even though it remains incomplete, it is perhaps our greatest achievement in publication in the history of the museum. Gradually, as with any relationship, I came to know him. He was meticulous. Only one ink spill out of some 1,000 illustrations. He was dedicated and dutiful. I found illustrations dated Christmas Day. He was humble and loyal. I discovered he lived only a short distance from my house, and I found myself standing out the front, imagining. I spent time in the rooms and halls he had worked in. I ate my lunch in the garden, under the largest tree, hoping it was big enough, old enough to have shaded him while he sketched, and collected specimens. It had started with a dusty old archive box, this obsession with Arthur Bartholomew, crammed tight with hundreds of zoological illustrations. As a researcher, it was natural for me to be curious and begin the unravelling. I continued to discover him, now longing to know his voice, his eyes. At work, I continued to find subtle reminders that although history had overlooked him, he had left an impression. A single tray of butterflies still pinned and tagged in his hand. A specimen of a zebrafinch, innocuous enough, except for the note on the back of its yellowing label, came down the chimney at Bartholomew's house. I felt his quiet pain and resilience as I catalogued the illustration he made only a few days after the funeral of his wife. And yet, in all this time, I could not find a picture of him. 2 years later, at the 11th hour of the project, almost by accident, there was my long-lost friend. I would have recognised him anywhere, with his gentle expression and kind eyes staring back at me for the first time. I was so happy, like finally meeting up with an old friend after years of correspondence. My relationship with Bartholomew continues. I still seek him out in unusual places, adding to my picture of him. Arthur has given me a new reverence for what I do. I cannot escape it. A strong bond has formed, and I feel responsible for his memory. This case is positioned in the 1850s to 1880s period of the exhibition, which deals with the idea of gold building the growth of Melbourne. At the beginning of this period, Melbourne's population was only 23,000, and yet by the end, 1880, it had exploded to over 850,000 people. Within the passage of only a few months in 1854, Melburnians saw the foundation of their public library, the University of Melbourne, the Age newspaper, and the National Museum of Victoria, and that's where this case comes into the Melbourne story. Histories of the museum from this period invariably centre around the director at the time, Sir Frederick McCoy. McCoy had the charm, tenacity and gall to generally get what he wanted, but his reputation for conflict was legendary. So whilst I love those stories about the scientific stashes and McCoy's run-ins with the government over money, what I wanted to portray here in the case was the sense of wonder for natural history that people in the colony had at the time. Many of the scientific specimens in this case also reveal fascinating stories about colonial life. Perhaps my favourite suite of objects from this case are the scientific illustrations that you can see at the back here. These illustrations form part of a much larger collection called the Prodromus Collection of some 1,000 illustrations. They were commissioned from 1857 to 1897 by Frederick McCoy for the museum's first publication, the Prodromus. The Prodromus was a vast undertaking which drew on the work of various artists, lithographers, and invariably a lot of the government's money. The most prolific of these artists was Arthur Bartholomew, who was also Frederick McCoy's attendant. Bartholomew's illustrations reveal his fastidious nature in the lab and his working conditions. In the laboratory, he would tend all the live specimens and illustrate them in the different stages of their life. And this methodology changed little over 40 years. So McCoy would bring these live specimens into the laboratory to Bartholomew, and he would put them into small cases known as Wardian cases. He would then issue each with an individual number, which you can note on the illustration here, the place of location and the date. Bartholomew would then carefully file the illustration in a plan drawer and go back to attending the ever-growing collection of live specimens. This butterfly illustration is an Australian painted lady, and it was collected on the grounds at Melbourne University. And as it came into Bartholomew's care, it was the caterpillar that you can see in the centre of the illustration. On the 12th of December 1860, Bartholomew noted that the larva had pupated. He then extracted the illustration and depicted the chrysalis hanging from the host plant. Bartholomew then had to wait until Christmas Day before the adult butterfly emerged. The illustration then sat in the collection for another 20 years before he would transfer it onto a lithographic stone to be published as plate 198 in the Prodromus. In 1859, to complete his study of seals, Frederick McCoy purchased a seal skull from Ludwig Becker, a naturalist and illustrator in Melbourne at the time. But again, in the archive, we find an intriguing story behind this relatively simple transaction in the form of the letter from Ludwig Becker offering it to Frederick McCoy for sale. The letter reveals Becker's excitement at coming across this seal on Punt Road in the summer heat of 1859. Young female seal caught alive vis-a-vis Wilhelmy's residence, Punt Road, not far from Gardiner's Creek Road, south. Sitting under a tree in the morning sun yesterday week. It was lively and galloped alongside Wilhelmy, who was leading it home with a rope. It lived 3 hours after we caught it, but if you will buy it, I think it will be the means of completing your observations on seals.